3 years. 3 years since Laurel Ashby had last let a stranger pass the cedar gate of her property on Galliano Island, without a form signed in triplicate, and a reference check that most people failed on the second question. 3 years of one sentence, delivered in the same measured tone she used for board calls and difficult conversations with lawyers. "I need some time alone with this." She watched people nod. She watched them back away. She watched the careful distance they maintained, as if grief were something you could catch through a screen door. 4 seconds was all she needed to know whether someone was looking at her or looking at what she had lost. Then came the Tuesday in October, with the kind of rain that comes off the Strait of Georgia sideways. Tate Burrow arrived at the end of her gravel drive in a white work truck with a cracked left taillight, a 9-year-old boy in the passenger seat eating a mandarin orange in sections, and a canvas bag over one shoulder that had seen a decade of job sites. He did not offer condolences. He did not glance at the photograph on the hallway shelf, the one with the man in it, the one every other tradesperson had found a reason to mention. He was already crouching at the base of the front steps, pressing his thumb into the wood where the stringer met the post, when he looked up and said 8 words. "Someone patched this and hoped you wouldn't notice." The woman who had not trusted a stranger in 3 years said, "Show me." The morning had begun badly. Tate had been standing at the counter of the kitchen in his rented half-duplex in Sydney, BC, trying to make a lunch that did not look like a lunch assembled by a man who had forgotten that children had opinions about food, when his phone went. The woman on the other end was the mother of his son's best friend, and she said the word fever, and then said sorry, and then said sorry again, and he stood there holding a butter knife and listening to the math rearrange itself inside his head. His son, Sam, was 9 and had already read the math. He was sitting at the kitchen table, pulling the sleeves of his hoodie down over his hands, and he looked at his father with the particular expression of a child who has learned to wait out the silence after bad news. "I'll just come," Sam said. "You'll just come," Tate agreed. He had no other option. The ferry to Galliano left at 7:30, and the job waiting on the other side was the only substantial contract he'd had since April. The woman who owned the property, Laurel Ashby, had been referred to him by a builder in Victoria, who described her as precise, private, and not interested in small talk. The job on paper was straightforward: assess and repair the structural damage to a heritage cottage that had been renovated badly by someone who should have known better. Sam ate toast over the sink and asked if the island had seals. Tate said probably. Sam put on his boots by the door without being asked, and Tate noticed that the laces on the left one were fraying near the aglet and added it to the list in his head that lived behind his left eye, the one that ran continuously and that his late wife, before she got sick, had called his worry ledger. She had said it affectionately. He had never once found it funny. They made the ferry by 4 minutes. Sam pressed his face against the salt-streaked glass the whole crossing, narrating the water birds. Tate drank bad coffee and looked at the drawings the property manager had emailed him and tried to understand what he was looking at. The structural report on the cottage was written in the kind of language that meant the person who wrote it had not wanted to be held accountable for what they were describing. The property sat at the end of a lane that turned to gravel after the main road and wound through second-growth fir to a gate that stood open. Beyond it, the cottage sat on a slight rise above the water, a 1940s cedar and stone building that had been designed by someone who understood the site and renovated 30 years later by someone who had not. The bones were good. Everything added after 1995 was not. Laurel Ashby was standing on the covered porch when they pulled up, and she watched the truck come to a stop, the way a person watches something they have decided to reserve judgment on. She was in her early 40s, dark-haired, dressed in the practical layers of someone who had lived with island weather long enough to stop apologizing to it. Her hands were in her jacket pockets, and her face was composed in the way faces get when composure has been practiced until it stops feeling like effort. She said good morning. She did not say anything about the child. Tate said good morning, introduced Sam, and turned his attention to the steps because the angle of the porch light had caught something that shouldn't have been there, a ridge along the stringer that told him the original wood had been sistered badly and covered with fresh paint to hide the repair. He crouched. He pressed his thumb in. The wood gave in a way that meant the moisture had been sitting in there for longer than the fresh paint suggested. "Someone patched this and hoped you wouldn't notice," he said. He said it the same way he would have said it to a colleague. Not softened, not dressed up. And when he looked up, the woman on the porch was looking at him with an expression he hadn't expected. Not offense. Something that resembled, of all things, relief. "Show me," she said. He showed her. He laid out what he was seeing in plain language. The sisterboards nailed over wrought rather than cut out. The flashing at the roof join that had been bent rather than replaced. The window on the north wall that had been recaulked around a frame that had already moved. None of it was accidental incompetence. It was the specific kind of shortcuts a person takes when they know the homeowner won't be there to check. Sam had drifted from the porch to the rock garden that ran along the south side of the cottage and was crouching beside a tide pool left by the last rain, examining something with the focused intensity he applied to most things that weren't homework. Laurel watched him for a moment. What's he found? Hard to say. Could be anything. He found a dead dragonfly on the ferry and carried it in his pocket for 2 hours. The corner of her mouth moved. It was not quite a smile, but it was in the same postal code. The morning settled into work. Tate walked the exterior first, then the interior, and made notes in the small craft paper pad he carried in his breast pocket, writing in the compressed shorthand he'd developed over 15 years of doing this work. Every room showed him the same thing in a different form. The original building, careful and considered, and then a layer of changes that had been made by someone who had access to the property and had used that access carelessly. The name on the renovation permit appeared twice in the documents Laurel's property manager had forwarded. Stephen Ashby, her brother-in-law, had managed the renovation while Laurel was at the hospital in Vancouver for the 9 months before her husband died. Tate did not say anything about that yet. It was the crawl space that changed the morning. The access hatch was in the utility room off the kitchen. Tate went in with a headlamp because that was what the job required, and he expected the usual. Pooled water, insulation that had been installed upside down, evidence of the kind of cost-cutting that happens below the sight line. He found that, and then he found something else. The main beam, the 6x10 Douglas fir that ran the length of the building and carried the load of the entire floor system, had been notched. Not cracked from age, not checked from drying, notched. 3 cuts in a row along the tension face, each one precise and identical in a way that made the pattern visible even in the narrow beam of a headlamp. A beam weakened that way would carry its load for a season, maybe 2, then fail on an ordinary morning when the weight of daily life finally found the place where the math had been made wrong on purpose. Tate sat in the dark of the crawl space for a long moment and listened to the sound of his own breathing and the distant sound of Sam outside, asking a question about something in the garden. He thought about the renovation permit with the brother-in-law's name on it. He thought about what it would mean to notch a beam in a house where a grieving woman lived alone. He thought about the fact that whoever had done it had known the beam's load path precisely. This was not a guess. This was structural knowledge applied to a specific outcome. He could close the hatch. He could write the report. He could list the notched beam as deferred maintenance and let someone else draw the conclusion when the floor dropped. He would be off the island before the ferry ran in the afternoon, and he would never have to know. He closed the hatch. He went up the service stairs to the kitchen. He found Laurel at the window with a mug in both hands, looking at the channel where the morning light was doing something considerable to the water. And he said, "I need to show you something, and after I show you, you're going to want to call someone. I'd like to ask you to wait. Not long, but wait." She set the mug down. She looked at him the way she had looked at the truck when it came up the drive. "Sit down," she said. He did not sit. He told her, standing in her kitchen with the crawlspace dirt still on his knees, what he had found under her floor, and what it meant structurally and what it meant beyond that. He used the word deliberate. He used the word load path. He watched her face. She did not move for a long time. Her hand, which had been resting flat on the counter, pressed down once, the tendons visible along the back of it, and then released. "Stephen," she said. It was not a question. His name is on the permit. He would have had access. He managed the entire renovation. I gave him full authority. My husband was dying and I could not be here, and I trusted him because he had been in this family for 16 years. She was looking past Tate at the wall. Her voice had not changed in pitch, only in texture, the way glass changes when it drops below a certain temperature. "He has been asking me for 3 months to sell the property. He says the estate is complicated, and the island property is a liability. He has sent 2 real estate agents here without calling first. I told him no. Both times. What happens to the property if you can't maintain it? It goes into a trust that my husband established. Stephen is one of 3 trustees. If the property is held in trust rather than owned outright, management decisions require a vote." She paused. A vote that Stephen, with 2 of his contacts on the trustee board, would control. Tate put his pencil flat on the counter. Outside the window, Sam had moved from the rock garden to the small cedar dock at the water's edge. He was lying on his stomach looking down into the water, probably narrating to himself. "Why not call the RCMP right now?" Tate said. "Because the renovation was permitted and inspected. Because every decision Stephen made was authorized by me in writing, in emails I sent from a hospital waiting room, when I was not sleeping and not thinking clearly. Because a notched beam in a crawl space, in a building that's 80 years old, is something a good lawyer describes as deferred maintenance until a forensic structural engineer says otherwise in a report that could take 6 weeks to commission." She held his eyes. "I have been in this house alone for 3 years. I know how to read the room when no one believes me." Tate was quiet. He looked at the beam diagram he'd roughed in his pad. "Then we don't call anyone yet," he said. "We build the case first." She studied him the way she had studied the stringer on the front steps. "You don't know me," she said. "You drove over on a Tuesday for a structural assessment. Why are you still in my kitchen?" He thought of Sam on the dock. He thought of the fraying lace on the left boot. He thought of the worry ledger behind his left eye and how it had been running very loud in the crawl space. "Because the beam is real," he said. "And someone made it that way on purpose, and I can't close the hatch on that." Something in her posture shifted. Not much. The way a door shifts when the latch finally aligns. "Aldrich," she said. He looked up from the pad. "My name," she said, "Laurel. People who stay in my kitchen past noon get to use it." Tate. By early afternoon, Sam had been fed a bowl of soup that Laurel produced from the back of the fridge, and who has learned to keep things on hand without knowing who might need them, and had been installed in the sitting room with a book about tide pools that he had found on the shelf and had not yet put down. He read the way he did everything, all at once without looking up. Tate and Laurel worked at the kitchen table with the renovation file spread between them and a fresh pot of tea neither of them had touched. The file told a story that the individual pieces had obscured. Every decision Stephen had made during the renovation had been defensible in isolation. Together, they described a deliberate pattern of reducing the structural integrity of the building in ways that would be attributed to age, weather, and the ordinary failures of an old cottage on a saltwater island. "He knows this building," Laurel said. "He and my husband grew up spending summers here. He knows which systems the inspector would check and which ones he wouldn't bother with." Her finger was on a line item in the electrical permit. "He specified the sub-panel himself. He told me the original one was a fire hazard." Tate looked at the sub-panel spec. "Who installed it?" "A contractor from the mainland. Company's dissolved now." He looked at the permit number. He looked at the date. "This was filed 3 weeks after your husband's diagnosis." The room held that for a moment. "He started planning before David was gone," she said. Her voice was very even. "He started planning while I was sitting in a hospital room." Tate looked at the crawlspace photograph he'd taken on his phone. The notches were clear in the image, even in bad light. 3 cuts, Even spacing, tension, fate. We need a record that doesn't disappear, he said. Not a photo on my phone. Something that lands somewhere he can't reach. I have a structural engineer in Victoria I've used on other properties. She's done expert testimony before. Laurel was already at her laptop. If I send her the photographs and the permit file tonight, she can give me a preliminary assessment by morning. Not the full report, but enough to establish that this is not deferred maintenance. And your lawyer? In Vancouver. She's been my family lawyer since before David died. She knows the trust structure. She knows Stephen. Laurel's hand rested on the keyboard. She will not be happy that I didn't call her 3 months ago. No, Tate said. She won't. Lori started sending across the table. Laurel looked at him across the table. It was the first time she had looked at him without assessment in the expression. What do you need from me for the structural record? Access to the crawl space again, good light, and 2 hours. I can document every point of interference, not just the beam. If he touched one thing on purpose, he touched others. Then we have the afternoon. They did. Tate went back under the building with a proper work light borrowed from his truck, and Laurel went with him to the hatch opening and held the light cable and passed things down when he asked for them, without making it ceremonial, which he appreciated. Sam came to watch after the tide pool book was finished, and sat cross-legged on the utility room floor and asked questions about load paths with the genuine curiosity of a child who had not yet learned that you were supposed to pretend to find some subjects boring. Laurel answered 2 of them before Tate got a chance to. He noticed that and said nothing about it. The documentation took 3 hours. By the time he had photographed and measured and noted every deliberate interference he could find, the light through the utility room window had gone the particular shade of amber that meant the afternoon was leaving. Tate climbed out with dirt on his jacket and a very clear picture in his head of what had been done to this building and by whom. He was thorough, Tate said, at the kitchen sink washing his hands, but he made one mistake. Laurel looked up from the laptop. The notches in the main beam are too even. The spacing is precise to about 2 millimeters. That's not someone who knows carpentry and got careless. That's someone who knows carpentry and was being careful. A careless cut would look different. These look like measurement. He dried his hands on a dish towel that had a blue heron on it. An engineer will know what that means in a report. It's the difference between wear and intent. Laurel was quiet for a moment. He was a Finnish carpenter, but before he went into property management, she said. Did his own renovations. Was good at it. Good enough to know the cut had to look right. Good enough to almost. She sent the photographs and the permit file to the structural engineer at 6 in the evening. She sent a separate, longer email to her lawyer in Vancouver. She did not ask Tate what to say in either message. She had been managing the language of difficult situations for a long time, and she knew how to do it. But she angled the laptop screen slightly so he could see what she was writing, and he took that for what it was. By 6:30, the ferry back to Swartz Bay had left without them. Laurel had said, when the time became obvious that the spare room was made up and there was a pullout in the sitting room, and she was not going to make them drive to the ferry dock in the dark. She said it the way people say things they have already decided, and Tate said thank you. And Sam said, with the composure of a child who has made peace with the unpredictable nature of his father's job, "Does the internet work here?" It did. They ate dinner at the kitchen table, the 3 of them. Pasta, with whatever was in the fridge, which turned out to be better than it sounded. Sam described the tide pool book in detail to Laurel, who listened with the full attention of someone who was genuinely interested rather than being polite, and who asked questions that proved it. Tate ate and watched and said very little, because the scene in front of him was doing something to the worry ledger that he couldn't quite name. After Sam was asleep on the pullout, with his phone on his chest and the tide pool book face down on the floor beside him, Tate came back to the kitchen to find Laurel at the table, with a glass of wine she had not been drinking, and the ferry schedule open on her laptop, for no apparent reason. He sat down across from her. The documentation file was closed. The lawyer email was sent. There was nothing left to do until morning. "You haven't asked me," she said without looking up, "why I've stayed here alone for 3 years. You haven't asked me," he said, "why I've been taking one-day contracts on Gulf Island since April." She looked up then. "What happened in April?" He told her in the measured way he told people things, not slowly, just without extra weight. His wife, Priya, had been sick for 2 years and had died in April, and he had not yet worked out how to be in a city, in their house, in the routines that still had her shape in them. So he was taking jobs that required ferries. Jobs that required him to be somewhere that was not where he had been before. Laurel set the wine glass down. "David died in November. 3 years ago November. I couldn't sell this place because it's where we spent every summer since we were 26, and I couldn't be in it with other people because other people brought the version of me that knew how to be his wife." She was looking at the dark window, the channel invisible behind it. "I became very good at being here alone. I became too good. And you stopped going to the ferry dock." "I stopped going to the ferry dock." Tate was quiet. Outside, the rain had started again, the soft, insistent rain of a coast autumn that does not perform. "My kid thinks you know more about tide pools than his teacher," he said. She almost laughed. It was not quite a laugh, but the attempt was genuine, and it surprised her, and he watched it surprise her, and neither of them said anything about it. "Go and sleep," she said. "Your engineer friend sends her preliminary by 7 in the morning." He did. He slept adequately. He woke at 6 when Sam's phone alarm went off in the next room and lay still for a moment listening to the rain on the cedar roof and the sound of the island adjusting to morning, and felt something in the worry ledger go briefly quiet. At 7:10, the structural engineer's preliminary assessment arrived. Tate was at the kitchen table with coffee. Laurel was already up, already at the counter, already reading. She forwarded it to her lawyer without speaking. Tate read over her shoulder because she had tilted the screen, and the report was, in the quiet language of structural professionals, unambiguous. The beam notches were machine-precise in their spacing and had been made with a circular saw, not a chisel or natural check. The interference points elsewhere in the structure were consistent with deliberate weakening rather than deferred maintenance. The engineer noted that she had testified in 3 similar cases in the past decade and was available for a call before 9. Laurel's lawyer called at 8:40. Tate took Sam to look at the dock while that call happened. Sam found a moon snail and carried it in a puddle cup for 20 minutes before releasing it with a ceremony that involved a brief speech. Tate sat on the dock boards and let the morning do what it was doing. Laurel came down to the dock at 9:15. "She's already filed a preservation order on the property," she said. "Stephen can't move any assets or documents related to the estate until the investigation is complete. She's also spoken to the RCMP liaison in Victoria who handles estate fraud. They want to move today." She stood at the end of the dock with her hands in her jacket pockets. The channel was doing the thing it did in morning light, all silver in motion. "She wants to know how the beam was found. I told her a structural contractor I hired found it in the course of an authorized assessment. She said that's clean. She said you don't have to be involved beyond the documentation." "I know," Tate said, "but I documented it, so I'm involved. That's fine." Laurel looked at him. "You drove over for a one-day contract. The ferry was good." Sam, who had been crouching at the edge of the dock examining something in the water, said without looking up, "Dad always says the job isn't finished until the thing that was wrong is actually fixed." There was a small pause. "Your father," Laurel said, "says the right things." By noon, 2 RCMP officers had been to the property, had reviewed the documentation, and had spoken to the structural engineer by phone. They were careful and professional and used the word preliminary frequently, which Tate understood to mean they believed what they were looking at, but had been burned before by saying so out loud too fast. They took the photographs and the permit file and the renovation contracts, and they left with the particular manner of people who have more work to do elsewhere and know it. Tate had his gear loaded in the truck by 1 o'clock. The next ferry left at 2:10, and there was a job in Saanich on Thursday that he needed to prep for tomorrow. Sam was on the porch with a second-tied pool book that Laurel had found on a high shelf and handed over with the kind of transaction that didn't require explanation. Tate was closing the truck bed when Laurel came out of the cottage with a paper bag that turned out to contain 2 bran muffins, a mandarin, and a bottle of water. "It's a long ferry," she said. "It is," he said. She set the bag on the passenger seat through the open window. Then she stood with her arms crossed against the wind off the channel and said, "Stephen is going to say the beam was already like that. He's going to find someone who will say it." "The engineer is going to say he's wrong," Tate said. "In a room, with a report, in front of people who know the difference. That's what forensic testimony is for. I know." She looked at the cedar gate. "I haven't had someone say that to me plainly in 3 years. Most people try to soften it. Softening it doesn't change the beam." She looked at him then, the full assessment she had been using since the truck came up the drive, and something in it resolved into a different expression, quieter, less guarded. "Thank you," she said, "for not closing the hatch." He nodded. He got in. The truck. Sam from the porch called, "Is the new elevator faster?" Both adults looked at him. "I mean," Sam waved the tide pool book vaguely. "In the next house. Do you have a faster elevator?" Laurel looked at Tate. Tate looked at his son. "I like it," she said. She stepped back from the truck. Tate turned the key and the engine caught on the first try, which felt like a good sign. Sam scrambled off the porch and into the back seat and buckled himself in and immediately opened the book again. The gravel crunched under the tires as they came around the bend of the lane and through the open gate. In the mirror, Tate could see the cottage above the water, the cedar weathered silver, the dock at the edge of the frame, the woman standing at the gate with her hands back in her jacket pockets watching the truck go. She was still standing there when the lane bent through the fir and the mirror showed him only trees. 3 weeks later, on a Thursday morning with thin November light coming off the straight, Laurel's lawyer called to say that Stephen Ashby had been formally charged with criminal mischief and breach of fiduciary duty, and that the estate trustee board had voted 2-1 to remove him from his position. The third trustee, a woman who had known David since university, had read the structural report and the RCMP file and had called Laurel directly to say she was sorry it had taken her this long to understand what had been happening. The cottage would need 4 months of work. Laurel had a list of what needed to be done, in order, starting with the main beam. She had emailed the list to one contractor. Tate read the email in the parking lot of a building supply store in Sydney, on his lunch break, sitting in the cab of the truck with the engine running for warmth. He read it twice. The list was precise and well organized and included, at the bottom, a note that said the spare room would be available on a standing basis for the duration of the project, and that the internet worked throughout the cottage, and that there was a second tide pool book she had located in a box in the storage room, a different one older, with hand-drawn illustrations that Sam might like. He wrote back 4 words. Start date, 2 weeks. He was there in 10 days. The fountain at the end of the lane, a small stone basin that had been clogged since the summer, was running again by the end of the first week, fed by the rain catchment system Tate rerouted while he had the drainage open anyway. Sam, who had taken to doing his homework at the kitchen table after school on the 2 afternoons a week the school had early release, looked up from a worksheet about fractions when he heard it running outside and went to the window. "What's that?" he said. "Water," Tate said, from the porch. "It's nice," Sam said. He went back to the fractions. He had begun bringing the tide pool book with him as a matter of course, the old one with the hand-drawn illustrations, and left it on the shelf by the door, as if it had always been there. The main beam took 11 days to sister correctly, which was 3 days longer than it should have taken because Tate was doing it without shortcuts and without hoping no one would check. Laurel came into the crawl space twice to see the progress and asked the right questions both times, and on the day the new timber was fully seated and the load properly transferred and the floor above them solid in the way it was supposed to have always been, she sat on the crawl space floor next to him in the beam of his headlamp and said, "It's a lot of work to fix something someone broke on purpose." "Most things are," he said. The last picture was the simplest one. The cedar dock at dusk, the channel going gold below it. Tate at one end with his jacket collar turned up, mug in both hands. Laurel at the other end, looking at the water. Sam in between them, lying on his stomach with his face over the edge, naming the things he could see beneath the surface, which were the same things he had always been able to see there, and which somehow kept being worth naming. The gate at the end of the lane was still open. It had been open now for 11 days, and neither of them had thought to close it.